Dr. Root, thank you for joining us and for flying all the way out from Minnesota to have a conversation with me in Southern California. In terms of your contribution to this sort of collection of ideas and thoughts, why don't you give us a kind of 30,000-foot view? What's the big picture summary of the claim or claims you're making?
Yeah, 30,000 feet. We'll see if I don't crash to the ground really quickly here. It's quite an ambitious, I think, paper, and in the sense not that it's great in that way, but that trying to take a really big view of this. And so I really want to make an argument that when we think about embodiment, that we have to think about bodies and time and how time affects us. And that particularly as late modern people, that time is accelerated, that it's always speeding up, it's always going faster. And that happens in just our technology doing that, and that has some good realities to it, as whoever's watching this now is streaming it on their computer. That's good, but it also speeds up other dynamics of our lives. Just social change happens faster, and trying to keep up with that, and just the pace of our lives go faster and faster. So really exploring how that speeding up, that acceleration impacts our bodies and challenges theological education. So I'm drawing from a social theorist named Hartmut Rosa, who really German sociologist who really picks up on these themes of acceleration. And he does this genealogy work, which is kind of trying to trace these dynamics that get us to where we are. And what I draw on in my paper is this kind of sense of how production and reproduction, kind of thinking about work and thinking about marriage and child rearing and sex and things like that, how those are really imagined in a very different way in late modernity. And so if we kind of look at this as a historical progression, and not necessarily historical in the sense of the field of history, but think about it kind of philosophically in this way, that there was a time where the unfolding of production and reproduction really happened at an intergenerational level. We say this in our churches all the time, like, we need to be more intergenerational. And what I mean by that is quite bold, actually. And intergenerational means like across generations, across time. And we used to have quite a deep imagination intergenerationally, like, where are the dead? Coldplay has that line, the dead are not dead, they're still in my head. Am I uncool to quote Coldplay or cool? I don't know.
Please quote them.
So, but the confession of the church, at least the Western church, has always been the dead are not dead. They're in the graveyard outside of the church building, and they're waiting with us. We remember them, that they gave us these practices, that they shared the gospel story with us, that they helped build this very congregation, this very building we're in, but they too are waiting for the return of Christ. But there was a deep sense that the way you worked and the way you loved, the way you brought children into the world was a really intergenerational reality. So sometimes you have young adults who will say things like, "My gosh, I get my knuckles go weak when I think about marriage, and it's for a lifetime, it's forever." Like, you go back anciently, like back into the ancient world, but particularly like the medieval world, marriage was like for connecting you to a legacy of, 1,000 years or something. Like, you think about carrying that burden. It wasn't just a lifetime. It was like for the next 8 generations, and then 8 generations past. So, but the big move is that in a modern world, particularly because of the way industrialization and other things speed us up, that we enter into a generational world. So there's always a timekeeper in those. There's someone who holds time for us, and in that intergenerational world, the timekeeper really is the church. And the church's job is to, in some sense, be the notary of who gets to be married, who is in charge of this land, things like that. But when you enter into kind of a modern world, thinking like late 17th, 18th century, and then into the mid 20th century, you enter into a time where it's really one generation that matters. And who holds time is the state holds time. And so the church is taken, its place as a timekeeper is taken by the state. And it's one generation. And so you can even think about kind of democracies function this way, that they really hold for one generation. And one of the points that I was really pushing at in my paper is to think about the denomination as a creation of that reality, that the denomination comes about as a one generational institution. And what I mean by that isn't that it can't live on for more than one generation, but every modern denomination can only exist for one more generation, in the sense that the next generation has to decide to enact their lives, say, as Presbyterians or as Methodists or whatever, or it doesn't exist, or that structure doesn't exist, which is why like denominations I know spend a lot of money on youth gatherings and other things, because at least there's 1 week where a generation can imagine what it would be like to be Lutheran, or what it would be like to be, Episcopalian or something like that. But that really is just kind of one generation, and we have that sense in the congregation, the denomination and its congregations do quite well in that kind of time period. You join a church, membership makes sense, you stay in that church for 30, 40 years, you serve on the board or the session or whatever, and it seems you get money to that congregation consistently. But Hartmut Rose's point is, after 1968, really, and into the late 20th century and the 21st century, that our clock has ticked forward, and we don't live at a generational speed. We live in an intra-generational speed, where we do kind of have this sense that we can live multiple lifetimes, or the life you're living is until further notice. Even your marriage, even the city you live in, that's until further notice. And we say this to young adults all the time, like, do it now. Have all the experiences you can have now in your 20s, because essentially in your 30s you're going to live a different life. And we have all sorts of kind of movie illustrations of this. Like I even think of the classic American Beauty, which is this kind of experience of breaking out of the generational constraints and trying to find your new life. And it takes on a certain moral weight. Like, we actually celebrate people who sometimes leave family, or for sure leave jobs. I mean, it's the Jerry Maguire moment where you're like, I'm doing something different. I'm gonna live a different lifetime.
Who's with me?
Yeah, who's with me? And so I'm trying to trace that and actually say theological education and just institutions, theological institutions, and then denominations have a much more difficult time, or a challenge ahead of them, when we enter into this intergenerational time. So people in your church, well, for this lifetime, they're going to be in it. But just because they're living this way now doesn't mean in 2 years, 4 years, new job, new lover, that they might not find a different church, or just decide the church isn't for them. So it's always kind of until further notice. And so I try to put the timekeeper there, that it goes from the church to the state to what I think has happened now, is that kind of Silicon Valley becomes the new timekeeper for us in many ways. And that is a long history, how we get to that, or maybe a weaving history, how we get to that. But it does mean different practices take shape. And even in theological education, we start celebrating those kind of Silicon Valley practices.
As you think then about the church and our response, so denominations are maybe even less than once in a lifetime vision. You've got theological education over here, training students going into some places who are still tasked with something.
Yeah.
So are we tasked as theological educators to give people tools to make this truncated vision of time meaningful? Or are we giving them tools to say, I'm opting out of that system, the church is an alternative community of timekeeping? Is it something of both?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I actually think that it rests in many ways the kind of it is the soft underbelly of a lot of theological construction for the last number of decades. Is it a kind of pushback in creating an alternative community that lives at a different time, that resists the state? And we have all sorts of realities. Is it kind of a return to Augustinian ontology? Like, there's been all sorts of kind of moves to retrieve so deeply that you almost abandon this. And I come from a perspective, like intellectually, where I just don't think that's really possible. I don't think it's possible to completely opt out of the accelerated reality. So it's so deeply inside of us, as well as in the structures of society, that I don't think we can just be like, well, we're going to gather these 150 people and we're not going to play the game. You would almost have to you would almost have to return to some kind of intentional living, monastic kind of way of life to do that. And you can see why monasteries do kind of pop up in certain ways in a different kind of view of time, and who keeps the time. That in many ways, in a lot of European villages, it was the priest, it was the monastery that kept time. And in some senses, they were the only ones with a clock. And the clock was there not to optimize our workload and to get the most out of our time, that the clock was there to remind us to pray. And that becomes a very kind of different reality. So, but I think at the core of it's such a kind of deeply embedded reality that even slowing down, those practices of resistance are necessary and we should do them, but it won't in itself be enough. This is just too embedded in everything. So we do have to think about different forms of action itself that resist this, so that our own actions get taken into this acceleration. So we need different forms of action. And the good news is we all have experienced those different forms of action. I mean, it's one of the reasons, here you are, like encounters with art usually have a different kind of form of action. And your experience of time usually isn't accelerated. It is full. It becomes full. You feel connected. Sometimes you don't even know how much time has passed. Or a conversation with a friend over late night. Like, you usually leave that and you can be kind of tired because you were up too late, but you also feel energized. You don't feel depleted. You don't feel like something was taken from you. If you have a long conversation with someone and then they end that conversation with, and that's why I think you're the perfect person to buy in to this condo development. Then you're like, yeah, then you feel like it was a waste of time because it wasn't actually a moment of resonant connection. It was really an instrumentalized relationship. So there are ways that when we can avoid the instrumentalization of relationships, and there's a point of just being with and being for, which I think has deep theological echoes of the very economy of God's nature in many ways, this participation in God's life, particularly from a kind of certain theological perspective that goes more east than west, that those do become real experiences. So there are ways, instead of just saying we are going to be the people who go Handmaid's Tale and we're gonna do this, we're gonna insulate ourselves, or maybe it's like M. Night Shyamalan's The Village or something. Like, we're gonna escape, we're gonna pretend that we're in a more pre-modern world and we're gonna try to live that way, which we know from that movie is not possible. Yeah. That instead, I think we have to find ways where these deep forms of connection happen, and how those really are experiences of the Spirit and experiences of being taken up into Christ, and continue to narrate those experiences.
What you're describing is not how seminary education has been imagined in the past, right? Teaching people how to wait. So if theological education is about schooling people or forming people into those who can wait and hold open-handed what emerges, what does a class look like? Like, what does a curriculum look like?
I think what I try to do as a teacher, I'll be autobiographical here. At a certain level, I think my horizon is not just my students. I could never do this without my students, but my horizon is to try to lean in and to say something true, to experience something true, to glimpse something beautiful. And I think the only way you can learn to think theologically is to watch someone think theologically. So what I often do in my classes is say, okay, now watch me think theologically about this film or about this experience someone's had in ministry. And I have to say all the time, you do not have to think like me. I'm gonna try to weave the tradition here in and practices in ministry in, and I'm gonna try to think of what revelation would look like, how Jesus Christ might be really encountering us in this moment through my theological imagination. And we'll do that together with your questions, and you're gonna participate in that, but I'm gonna drive that. But you don't have to do that. And when you do your assignments, or particularly when you're out in ministry, you don't have to do that. But you do have to be able to think theologically. And so what I try to do, even with my content in the class, is to give my students what I would call now like a watchword that they can hold on to, that kind of encompasses a narrative shape of how they anticipate God might act in the world, and then to send them into the world and into their lives with that watchword. And I do think that's the pastoral task, that if we do think there's this in-breaking action, if God does arrive, if God does show up, the work has to be done leadership-wise is to prepare people's imaginations for that, so that they don't have kind of observation blindness. That and when we do that through prayer and classic practices, but we also need these kind of watchwords of how God moves in here. And I think the core task of the pastoral practice or the pastoral imagination, the pastoral identity is to gather from the community these stories and synthesize them in a way that we have a watchword. This is how this God arrives here. This is how the God has arrived historically here. This is how we've read scripture together. Now what we do is we wait together and we narrate these experiences and we go into the world and serve the world in and through the watchword, but we're formed by this watchword. And I'm actually taking that from the early Karl Barth was inspired by these pietist Germans named the Blumhardts, father and son. And Christoph Blumhardt had this deep sense of waiting, that waiting is the most core act we take, that there's a sense of waiting action, he even called it. And that you wait not sitting on your hands in a kind of bored way, not in a kind of Homer Simpson, when is the 13-second microwave going to be over? Yeah. But you wait in anticipation and you wait with a watchword. And I think that is a way to anticipate and to form ourselves for this kind of inbreaking transcendence, to form a community to see God move in that way.
One thing that you get at is you have these sort of, the concluding non-scientific postscript, if you will, of what you've done. And this is sort of the most kind of in-work part of what you're doing. And I've noticed this very same thing here at Fuller, and you're saying at Luther, it's a similar thing where students aren't coming for credentialing anymore so much. Right. Denominations have collapsed. That was funding that whole project because you're going back into the structure, Okay. But now they're coming to, in your words, explore, heal, and do something with their time. And I couldn't tell if that was sort of critical or descriptive or constructive, going like, what if seminary was a place where you came and you healed, you explored, and in the good sense, as I was saying before, you wasted time. Would that be how you would say this is what seminary education might look like?
Yeah, I think that statement, I do mean it positively and I do mean it critically, I think. And I think the things we gain out of that is this disposition of kind of being a pilgrim, if you will, being a seeker. And I think that's the only way to kind of inhabit this kind of world that we're living in. This world where we want and we anticipate God arriving is to be a kind of seeker in that way, is to kind of have an openness to take on and to expect. So I do think that seminary education has to form people in that way. And I think like Bonhoeffer's words from Life Together could not be more true, I think, and really challenge us, is inside a certain age of authenticity and inside the fear of the way all institutional structures, let alone the church. I think we do have to be really aware. Like it appears every institutional structure has really failed people, from like the Olympic gymnastics to the Boy Scouts. Like every has had this kind of reckoning of failing us. But the church has. The church is culpable for all sorts of things that we should not shy away from and we should have to face. But that does lead to a certain response where we start to want the idea of the church more than the real church. That we start to want the ideal more. And I do think we have to break that. But that does come with a commitment to the church. So Bonhoeffer says so powerfully, if you love the idea of the church more than the real church, then you don't love the church. And so what does it actually mean to form people in a way that they can go into a very unideal place and deal with discord, which Bonhoeffer also says in Life Together, like a church that's alive is in discord, which is similar to a family that's alive is in discord. Kids who aren't fighting aren't also connecting, So moving in and out of discord does not mean that you're a diabolically toxic place. It can get there, and we should be aware of that. But fighting and disagreeing also are just signs of being alive. And so I do want us to think about that more, is how do we, in our classrooms, and then how does the pastoral kind of imagination and identity think more about how do we bring life to a church, not how do we bring growth, or how do we bring more resources, or how do we bring more relevance, but how do we bring life? And the big point of my whole paper is that the way we think about bringing growth and relevance and resources may actually suck life away. And it actually could lead to deeply depressed churches. And I don't mean like the individuals are clinically depressed. I mean the objective spirit of the community becomes that. There's a great book by a Parisian scholar named Alan Ehrenberg, who has this book called, do you know this book?
I know the scholar.
Okay,
I don't know
he has
the
a book called The Weariness of the Self. But it's much better, and it's French, which I shouldn't do this on film, is try to say something in French.
Please do. I will love it.
I think it is the la fatigue d'être soi, and it's the fatigue of being yourself. And his argument is that it's a genealogy, which I'm addicted to genealogies, but it's a genealogy of depression. And he thinks that depression post 1970s is a big issue that the West deals with. But he doesn't think depression is a problem of happiness or a absence of happiness. It's actually, he calls it a pathology of change. And inside the need to continue to curate and perform the self, that depression comes upon us when we just simply don't have the energy to keep changing. And this is my big fear with the push at many institutions to think about, like, we have to innovate, we have to find the new thing, is that you impose this kind of need to continue to accelerate, to do more, to change. And part of this is just what we inherit from neoliberalism. Like, plateaued growth in a company is a dead company. You don't invest in that. You need to show continued growth. So sometimes I think, and this is more tacit than explicit, but we say to a congregation, like, we're going to change. Like, yes, change is always good. So, okay, it means we're all going to have to do a little bit more. We're going to have to make this change. But that also comes with the realization that you're going to have to do a little more next year, and a little more this year, and a little more next year. And that becomes exhausting. And I know a lot of pastors who would describe what's going on in their local synod or what's going on in their congregation is it feels like a kind of depressive phase has come over them, which is really ironic because, 20 years ago, you would go to a gathering of pastors and denominational leaders, and not everyone would agree that the church needs to change. And now everyone agrees that it needs to change, but no one knows how, or worse, it's not even a crisis of creativity. No one has the energy for it.
Yeah.
And especially coming out of this pandemic, like, no one has the energy for it.
Being creative is one of the most exhausting things. It's a lot of work. And if the appeal or the urge or prompting to innovate is an infinitely receding horizon, that could be its own version of exhaustion. So even if we innovate now, we know it'll never be enough, right? So you always are like, I'm not enough, we're not enough. I wonder if what we've lost in some ways is the sense of time, deep time, and or even just genealogical time to our ancestors, the dead are with us.
Right.
That would also shift us to the future and say, just as the dead are with us, we are haunting the spaces of our descendants.
Yeah.
So if you're saying we're sucking the life out of congregations and seminary, whatever, what does it mean for us to imagine ourselves as the ghosts of our ancestors in that way of thinking about maybe education, theology in general?
I think a huge piece of what it means to do Christian formation is to kind of anticipate, what does it mean even right now, maybe as a healthy-bodied person, what does it mean to be preparing to die, and to die well, and to die as a Christian in confession of something like that? I mean, even saying it, I'm sure people watching this right now, like, they get a little, uncomfortable, and it feels really, really weird. But you also have to think it in the reverse. And what kind of society is this? Like, what kind of society have we created where we can live utterly in the denial of our finitude? Like, that's really quite. So, like, thinking what theological education does, like, how does it prepare people to die? And that can be misunderstood, but it's like, how do you live fully in a way as a creature before a creator? What does that really mean? And I think at the core, what it points to, and we were just talking about it, like asking the question of how will God arrive? How do we prepare ourselves for God arriving? And how do we have that watchword to be able to see that? I've been other places where people do want to say those things, like ask congregational leaders, like, where's God in your church? Where's God in your community? How do you become close to God? And I do think we need to recover that. To dare ask that question is a dangerous question. You should be very nervous. And I think in most of our theological classrooms, there isn't a kind of nervous energy that bubbles up in the stomach again. I'm like, oh my gosh, that isn't there. We're in some kind of platitude zone or something. But there should be, to ask the question, where is God moving? Particularly this God made known to us in Jesus Christ. You should be very uncomfortable to ask that question or very nervous, because where this God is going to be found is in dead places, bringing life out of death. And to follow this God is to participate in death, always for the sake of life, for newness coming out of that death. But the minister will be called, the church will be called, the seminary will be called into calling a thing what it is and dying, or at least finding the dynamic moment of ministry that comes from God's own being through God's act that ministers to the world. And where God ministers to the world are in places of dead wombs and nations that have been under the thumb of the biggest military industrial complex ever known to people, and in the tomb of Jesus Christ's dead body, bringing life to it. So to ask, where is God at work, is also to go to the cross and is to have to recognize that you are a creature who will die, but your God will never leave you in death, and your God will become closest in death, which is another whole way of forming the community. How do we know? We don't get to control this, but how do we become the kind of community when things start to seem impossible, when impossibility starts to really wrap itself around us like a cloak, that we stop, we breathe, we wait, and we anticipate that our God moves in these moments, that our God shows up at these times. We have no magical incantation that can make that so. We are talking about a God who is God, and this God will move as this God wants to move. And there are no Harry Potter, spells that can bring this God. But we do know that whoever this God is the God who frees Israel from Egypt and raises Jesus from the dead. So when we find those same kind of experiences or echoes of those same kind of experiences in our own communities, we take a breath, we wait, we pray, we anticipate that this God will show up and minister to us and minister to the world.
That's a great way to end, I think. I can't think of a better one. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts on all this, because I think it's one of those orthogonal ways into a really important conversation. You go, how did we start with timekeepers and sex, and now we're talking about death and resurrection? So really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thanks.